Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex, coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of... Since I'm still trying to knock out my TBR pile from last year in regards to the books that viewers had recommended to me, in this episode I am going to review Julia by Peter Straub, which this was recommended to me by my good friend Tiny Roebuck, as she explained that Julia never received the love that it deserved like how Ghost Story did. And very much like Ghost Story, when I was a kid, I had seen the movie adaptation of this book, which was called The Haunting of Julia. So, going into this, I had a pretty good idea of what to expect. However, after I finished my read, I discovered that the movie only touched on a fragment of the book. Also, since my good online friend Gina had been wanting to read Peter Straub, I invited her to read this with me, which, of course, we had a lot of really great discussions about what went down. Now, before I get into the horrors of what Julia experienced while she stayed at the house on Ilchester Place, I would just like to thank Tiny for recommending this book, and I would like to thank Gina for reading it with me. So, if either of you are watching, I hope you enjoy this review. Julia by Peter Straub takes place in the 1970s and introduces the protagonist, Julia Lofting, who has recently left a mental institution after being devastated by the death of her daughter, Kate. And since she has no plans to return to her overbearing husband, Magnus, she purchases an old house on Ilchester Place in Kensington, where she plans to start a new life. However, although Julia is ready to move forward, the past refuses to let her go, because on her first day of moving into this old house, she encounters a young girl who could easily be Kate. Shortly thereafter, Magnus begins harassing Julia, and he demands that she return home to him. But despite them having this dispute, Julia attempts to remain friends with Magnus's sister Lily. Then one day, as she's speaking with Lily, Lily suggests that they have a seance at Julia's new house with her spiritualist group. Well, although Julia is a skeptic, she does allow the seance, but after it's over, she eventually becomes a believer because she comes to terms with the fact that she's being haunted by a malevolent spirit of a little girl who wants revenge. And while those around her believe that Julia needs to be committed to an asylum once again, Julia soon discovers that she has no one but herself to rely on as a dark mystery unfolds before her. Published in 1975, Julia was Peter Straub's first supernatural novel. Prior to this groundbreaking classic, his debut novel was a relationship drama titled Marriages that was not well received. After Marriages, Straub had written another novel called Under Venus, which was rejected by his publishers until the 1980s. Since Straub had not succeeded by writing drama, his agent advised him to try writing a Gothic novel. Because of his agent's advice, Straub wrote Julia, which prospered greater than his first non-horror novel. Yet Straub wouldn't become a best-selling author until his third ghost-inspired novel, Ghost Story. After Julia's success, it inspired the British-produced movie Full Circle starring Mia Farrow, which was released in 1977. Then upon its American release, it gained the title The Haunting of Julia. Fun facts! Here's a few things you might not know about Peter Straub. In an interview for Realms of Night, Straub explained that his wife supported them while he looked for a job. At this time, because of the ground that Ira Levin and Thomas Tryon laid, he noticed horror novels could be good fiction. So he wrote two Jamesian type of novels, which was Julia and If You Could See Me Now. He added that these books saved his life and established the basis for everything that came later. While horror has served Straub well, and he constantly read through his childhood, his father hoped that he would grow up to be a professional athlete, while his mother wanted him to be a Lutheran minister. Now that we have that covered, it's time to move on to the spoilers segment, which, if you haven't read this book before, I'm about to reveal some things that could ruin the experience for you. So if you would like to click away, all you have to do is scroll down and you'll see a pinned comment at the top of the comment section, which in that comment is going to be a timestamp where if you were to click on that, it would direct you away from the spoilers and bring you to the thoughts section. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this. So, ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few of my favorite moments. First up is the seance. Now, prior to this, there had already been some disturbing things that had happened to Julia, like no matter how many times she turns the heaters off, they turn back on. Also, the water has this greasy coin smell to it. She feels like she's being watched. She feels like someone has invaded her home. And she has this reoccurring horrendous nightmare where she is unable to save her dying daughter. So, despite all of this going down, she allows Lily's group of friends to hold a seance in her home. And upon Lily's friend Miss Flood arriving, which Miss Flood is the medium among all of them, she explains that Julia is a skeptic, so this might muddy things up a little bit. Well, as everyone's hobnobbing, Julia and Miss Flood have the opportunity to speak, and this is when Miss Flood explains that the house feels funny, and she elaborates to Julia what a poltergeist is. Then, after Miss Flood starts the seance, Julia goes into this hypnotic type of state where she believes that she has encountered Kate. However, as soon as this happens, Miss Flood suffers an attack where she's pushed down to the couch and she is strangled to the point where her eyes are bulging and her face is turning purple. Then, after she snaps out of the episode, she vows that she's never going to do another seance again, and she warns for Julia to leave because she is in danger. So, even though I knew the seance would provide us with some results, I honestly did not know what to expect. And up until this point, I really felt like the haunting that Julia experienced could have been easily explained. Like, instead of her being terrorized by a ghost, this was all the result of her husband stalking her, or this was because she was mentally unwell, or a mixture of the two. However, after Miss Flood was attacked, I was like, okay, no matter what is going on, there is without a doubt a malevolent spirit inside this house. Also, I really felt like even though Olivia was already strong enough to show herself before the seance, I think that the door that was open during the seance made the veil between Julia and Olivia even that much thinner. As a side note, even though at this point Julia was a skeptic, had I been in her shoes, I would have taken into consideration all of the crap that went down at Ilchester Place in such a small amount of time, and I would have listened to Miss Flood and gotten the hell out of there. I mean, it's not like she was poor or didn't have anywhere to go. The world was literally her oyster. But, of course, Julia was so damn determined to stay there, and eventually she felt obligated to try to bring Olivia's spirit peace. My next favorite moment was when Julia learned about the history of her house, which this came about because one night when she couldn't go to sleep, she started reading a book that her sister-in-law had given her regarding the history of Ilchester Place. And as she's reading up on the history of her home, she discovers that a woman by the name of Heather Rudge, who was infamous for throwing these huge, lavish parties, lived there with her daughter Olivia. And it was during this time that Olivia had been suspected of murdering a child on the playground nearby. But since the child had been molested, authorities pointed their fingers at a vagrant and ended up killing the wrong man. Then, about 2 months later, Heather called the police station and explained that she murdered Olivia because her daughter was evil. It was at this point that I realized if Charles Manson had been born a little girl, he would have been Olivia, especially since she was so skilled at creating and orchestrating a cult. Also, because of Olivia's homicidal tendencies, Gina and I felt like her character was inspired by a real life killer. Now, for Gina, because of Olivia killing the Braden boy, she was reminded of the murderer named Jesse Pomeroy, who was the youngest person convicted of first-degree murder in the state of Massachusetts. Whereas I was reminded of the murderer Mary Bell, who had killed two preschool boys in England during 1968. By the way, as I was researching this book, I tried to find out if Olivia's character had been inspired by an actual killer, but unfortunately I wasn't able to find anything. So if you have any insight in regards to this subject, please let me know. Otherwise, this was a very unsettling moment because I feel like this just kind of put everything in stone that Julia was living in a truly evil place. The final moment that stood out to me was the grand finale. Now, prior to this, Julia had been having these hyper-realistic reoccurring dreams where she's wandering through a city of urban decay trying to find help for her dying daughter Kate. However, somewhere along the lines, this dream world blurs with her reality, and I don't know if this is because she's having a spiritual experience, or if this is the results of her having a broken mind, or if this is because she's being drugged, or all three of those. But as the worlds start to blend, she sees people who are disfigured, as well as people who turn into animals, and people who appear to be the walking dead. After having those experiences, we finally make it to the end of the book where Julia wakes up to her house literally being ripped apart. And this is when she has the epiphany that Olivia does not want peace. But instead of Julia staying in reality, she fades into her dream world where she takes a steak knife and walks onto the rooftop. But once she gets up there, she realizes that Olivia is with her, and she gets trapped in this column of dusty wind that leads to her death. Then, after her dead body is found, even though Julia had written a note explaining that she wasn't suicidal, her death is ruled as a suicide. This ending was very unexpected, and it left me with a lot of questions that I will probably never have answers to. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because in my opinion, the unsolved mystery is more unsettling than having closure. Which, it makes sense that the reader wouldn't have closure at the end of this book, because Julia's character never had closure. And out of the things that I'm left in the dark about, aside from if Julia was actually haunted or not, I'm curious to how her body was found and what condition it was found in, where people thought she committed suicide. Also, I'm curious to exactly who was killing everyone if a ghost couldn't do it, and if that killer is still at large. But anywho, this is what good literature does. It makes the reader question what they've read, and it just leaves them where they're thinking about what possibilities could have actually gone down. And for lack of a better word, it fucks with your head, which is exactly what this book does. I would like to use this opportunity to bitch about the sibling couple, Magnus and Lily. First off, I'm just going to go in and call the elephant out in the room. Holy VC Andrews, YouTube. Like, for real. If Magnus would have given Lily an inch, she would have taken it. And if you haven't caught my drift, I'll spell it out for you. Lily would have rode Magnus so hard she would have jiggled his damn teeth loose. And yes, they are actually blood related. So, With that little tidbit of delightful information out of the way, I honestly don't know which one of these asswipes was worse. Like, you have Magnus, who will literally bang anything that moves, except for his thirsty ass sister, thank God. But while he's out swinging his wing, he does this all in front of his wife, who he tries to control. And to top it off, he's over there just rolling in Julia's money like he has no cares in the world. And when it comes time to purchase her a present, guess whose money he uses? It sure as hell wasn't his own. No, he uses Julia's money to buy her presents. Like, no joke, y'all. This dude was literally nothing more than a bottomless puddle of douche water. Then we have Lily. Now, what this brother-loving backstabber has taught us is if you decide to befriend the sibling of your ex-piece, do so with caution. Because, girl, let me tell you, sloppy bitches like Lily do exist in reality. And these are the kind of bitches where you can tell them something in confidence and explain whatever you do not tell this individual what I just told you. Then they will turn around and spill the beans to the individual who you just said not to say shit to. And girl, I know you know exactly what I'm talking about here. As a matter of fact, as these words are coming out of my mouth, you're probably like, yep, I know a Lily. Now, I will admit, for a hot minute there, I did think Lily wasn't as bad as Magnus. But as soon as I thought that, this old vulture was like, let's just take Julia and throw her in an insane asylum. Then let's take control of all of her assets. Which, in all honesty, I wish somebody would have kicked Magnus and Lily and their assets, but that didn't happen. Anywho, there is a lesson to be learned from Magnus and Lily, which this is if you ever come across a sibling couple who seems like the adult versions of those crazy ass kids from Turn of the Screw, stay the hell away. Julia by Peter Straub was a well-written gothic horror novel that provided a great slow burn. And in a lot of ways, it reminded me of Turn of the Screw. Which, some of the reasons why I feel this way is because I couldn't really trust the reliability of our protagonist. Then we had a sibling couple by the names of Magnus and Lily, who reminded me of Miles and Flora, and it seemed like the name of the game for the major antagonist was corruption. Aside from that, the character development was rich and complex, and the book focused on a lot of hard-hitting topics, like it presented grief, gaining independence, the toxic male, the manipulative female, as well as child death and murder. Character-wise, now that I've read a couple of stories by Peter Straub, it's without a doubt that he is a master when it comes down to creating complex characters. And now that I understand how he works, it makes sense that he would co-write a couple of books with Stephen King. Which, by the way, I do still need to read The Talisman and Black House, so hopefully maybe later this year. But anywho, as far as Julia's character development is concerned, she was the only one who I truly rooted for from beginning to end, because even though she made a big mistake, I felt like she only had the best of intentions. Plus, she seemed like she was an all-around good person who had been dealt a shitty hand, and I wanted for her to succeed. Now, despite how solid Julia felt, the rest of the main characters were gray. And what I mean by that is, even though Magnus and Lily were not a cup of tea whatsoever, at the same time, they weren't completely heartless. Like, even though they were both money-grubbing backstabbers that wanted to control Julia, when it came down to it being a life-or-death circumstance for her, they actually did show concern for her well-being. Theme-wise, grief is a heavy topic in this book, and for Julia, it's grief without closure. Now, what I really find interesting was when I compared Julia's character to Heather's character, because even though they were similar in both being mothers who had daughters that had passed away, they reacted completely different to those deaths. Like, for example, Julia grieved her daughter, and she had to be institutionalized due to the trauma that came along with her daughter's death. And once she left the institution, she had created this false scenario so she could cope with reality, which, because of this, it made it where her accountability of what was going on throughout the entire book could not be relied on. But on top of that, she continuously had this horrendous nightmare where she was never able to save her daughter. Then, on the reverse side of the coin, we have Heather, which Heather has no grief or remorse for her daughter's death whatsoever. And I really can't elaborate more on that because I would give away some spoilers, so moving on. Another strong subject regarded gaining independence after leaving a toxic relationship. And personally, I have to give Julia kudos for trying to create a new life path for herself this soon after having gone through such a traumatic event. However, at the same time, I would have taken Miss Flood's advice and returned to America, which, had Julia done this, it would have allowed her to go back to the basics of her roots, and she would have been able to leave behind the toxic cesspool that she had surrounded herself with entirely. However, at the same time, I would have taken Miss Flood's advice and returned to America, which, had Julia done this, it would have allowed her to go back to the basics of her roots, and she would have been able to leave behind the toxic cesspool in its entirety. Which, because of what happens, it makes me think that for some people, starting a new and unfamiliar path can be good. But for others, they might need to return to the basics of their roots and start over again from there. It all just depends on the circumstance. Adding on to that subject, this book shows that whenever you become more independent, there will be toxic people out there who try to hold you back and control you. Now, when toxic people pull this card, it's because they won't be happy until you're as miserable as they are. And I guess the same could be said for those surrounding Julia. However, with Magnus, he wants Julia back, and Lily wants that for him. But the cherry on the cake is they want to control Julia's finances, because when Magnus married her, he married into money. And because of the stunts that Magnus and Lily pull, this is where the toxic male and manipulative female come into play. Overall, Julia didn't scare me or gross me out. However, it was extremely creepy, and there were even a few times where it was disturbing. Also, it kept me on the edge of my seat from beginning to end. Julia by Peter Straub was a thought-provoking novel that Gina and I both thoroughly enjoyed. But with that said, this book might not be for everyone because the ending presents more questions than it does answers. So if you're the kind of person who has to have all of the loose ends tied up, then this book might not be for you. Also, if you are the kind of person who coordinates what you read with a specific time of year, Julia takes place in the summer, so reading this during the hotter months would be the perfect time. And overall, I do highly recommend Julia, as it was a very creepy ghost story. It was beautifully written, and it also had some very complex characters. Now that it's time to close out my video, I would like to give a shout out to these wonderful people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of my Patreon contributors are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account as well, I do have a link available in the description section of this video, where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out like what you see here at the end of my videos. And for $10 a month, I'll still give you that shout out, but I do creepy photography on the side, so at the beginning of every month, I'll send you over one of my creepy photos, and once you receive that, you can print it off, do whatever you like. So if you're able to contribute, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can continue to have a good time together. Also, if you would like to hunt me down on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok are all available in the description section of this episode. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe because I have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week and sweet nightmares.